Please welcome Dr. Kevin Roberts, President of the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action.
Thank you. Thanks, you're very kind. Welcome to all of you here in person and those of you who've joined online. This is a momentous occasion for us at Heritage, not just because we've been talking about doing this event for a while, I'll come back to that in a minute, but also because this is literally, and I'm using that word on purpose, the most important issue facing the United States. Why is that? Because it's the most important issue, the family, facing humankind. And so at Heritage, we have believed for a long time, even before it became popular parlance in the White House, that this is the dawn of America's golden age. There are many reasons, many statistics that we could cite for that, and yet the headwind to America's golden age is the deterioration of the most important institution in human life, and that is the family. And so, interestingly, at the same time that the great leader of our country is talking about America's golden age, on this side of Washington, evidenced by the mess that is known as Congress yesterday, there are many reasons that we might think there are problems with that. And on this side of the city, there's a lot of worst case scenario thinking, not just about the midterm elections, the state of the culture, and so on. Well, at Heritage, we don't believe in engaging in that. We believe in acknowledging reality, and we will certainly do that with the panelists we have here this morning. But we believe in engaging in best case scenario thinking. That is to say, flip that question on its head and ask, what if we had the audacity as a people, the audacity of this generation of Americans and friends around the world, as one of our panelists will indicate, to engage in best case scenario thinking about innovative policies that the federal and state governments can engage in, can implement to help address the problems of the deterioration of the family. That's what we do here at Heritage, with smiles on our faces. And so if you will permit me a moment of personal privilege as the CEO of this enterprise, I could not be prouder of my colleagues across the board, all of the policy issues that we work on, than their work on this issue. Because all of our other work is for naught if we get this wrong. And so that's a way of saying thank you for being part of this effort. It's a particular way of identifying and complimenting two colleagues, especially Dr. Jay Richards and Roger Severino, for pushing forward this initiative. And obviously many other colleagues who were vital to that, but it really did require their leadership. And so enjoy this day. This is not the first time we're going to do this event. We're going to do events like this until we see a reversal in these trends. So thanks for being part of it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jay Richards to the stage.
Wow, thanks so much, Dr. Roberts. As Kevin mentioned, this was a labor of love at the Heritage Foundation. We spent well over 3 years on this. But we were aware in doing it, one, of how difficult these questions are, especially if you're trying to find policy response to them. The question very specifically is often just described as a kind of demographic crisis, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But we very quickly became convinced at Heritage that the demographic crisis should not be focused on in isolation, but is fundamentally a question of family formation. But as we spent the several years working on the foundational report, we were of course aware of the fact that there are a number of people, including several that are here in this room this morning, that had been working on this issue when it wasn't cool. Now, I don't know that it's gotten cool yet, so it's still a sort of a heavy slog. Honestly, we decided at Heritage, okay, if you ask sort of voters what's on their minds, they might not list this initially, because this is a long-term crisis in the sense that it's almost always going to be after the next election. Nevertheless, we think it's fundamental to the survival of the American experiment and of civilization itself that families form. And so I'm delighted to be able to begin this morning with a panel with some of the people that had been working on this diligently in their respective spheres, 3 here in the US and 1 internationally. So let me just very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I will welcome them to the stage. versus our friend Patrick Brown. Patrick's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington, D.C., celebrating their 50th anniversary actually tonight, where his work focuses on pro-family economic and social policy. His writing has appeared in major outlets like the New York Times, National Review, the Free Press, and elsewhere, and he frequently speaks on what a robust pro-family agenda can and should look like. He's a former senior policy advisor to Congress's Joint Economic Committee and lives in South Carolina with his wife and 4 kids, and his wife actually joins us here this morning. Next is Vladimir Gorchev, Vlatko, who serves as the National Coordinator for Demography, Youth, and Human Resources in Macedonia. He graduated from the Faculty of Law, Justianus Primus in Skopje, in the Political Science Department. Gorchev served 5 consecutive terms in the Macedonian Parliament between 2006 in 2020, and he didn't want me to mention this, but I'm going to mention it anyway. In 2008, the parliamentary election, he won the largest vote margin in Macedonia's election history. He's married and is the father of 4 children. Next is Dr. Carrie Gress, a longtime friend, who is the editor of the online magazine Theology of Home. Her work has appeared in many outlets. I'll just give you a few: National Review, Newsweek, and the Wall Street Journal. She's a frequent radio and podcast guest and has been featured on television networks such as Fox, BBC, and EWTN. She is the best-selling author of 11 books, and her most recent books include The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Destroyed Us, and the just-published Something Wicked, Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity, which just came out a few months ago. She has a way of nailing topics with titles. I can tell you, I'd love to give you all 11 of the books she's written. Finally is Dr. Lyman Stone, who is a demographer and sociologist that has been working on this issue for years. I think he may be the first person that I ever followed on X, formerly Twitter, on these questions. He's now the director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies and the director of research at the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence. He lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife and 4 children. Please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. Isn't it great how we have the sort of faces over the chairs here to keep things simple? So, well, welcome. I've been looking forward to this. Well, in a sense, for years. We knew we'd eventually do an event like this, but since our family policy report came out earlier this year, we've been really looking forward to it. And Lyman, I can remember talking to you and Brad Wilcox earlier. Roger and I sort of floated some of these ideas. We've really benefited from that. In fact, all of you. But let's set the stage a little bit. Patrick, maybe I'll start with you, because not everyone knows exactly what the demographic crisis is. Alas, I'm sorry, Lyman, not everyone's following you on Twitter yet. So exactly. So lay it out here for us. What's the fundamental problem and the question that we're talking about, and in fact many other countries were talking about before we did?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Jay. Thank you, Dr. Roberts and Heritage, for hosting this essentially important event. This is so exciting to kind of feel like the conversation around family formation and birth rates and what we can do to make America more pro-family is really coming to its own, and not a moment too soon, hopefully not too late either. This is a problem, obviously, here in the U.S. and you can see around the globe. I think, thanks in large part to Lyman's efforts, Elon, others who are sort of sounding the alarm of birth rate catastrophe, sometimes a little bit too much doom and gloomism, but there's a sense in which people are recognizing that this is actually becoming not just the province of people who look at spreadsheets all day and worry about where we're headed, but actually what this means for rural maternity wards and schools and soon higher education. The economic and cultural consequences of permanent low birth rates are going to be deleterious in the extreme. So it's good to have this conversation, what we can do about it, and also to think about the upstream factors that are leading into this, which your report does so well, thinking about not just how do we increase the number of births, mathematically, technically, however you want to look at it, but thinking about the ecosystem the institutions and the scripts and the models that we're following, and recognizing that the biggest driver of declining birth rates, especially here in the U.S., is declining marriage. And if we're not fixing the family, and if we're not helping men and women become more marriageable, then we're going to continue to see this persist. Because among married women, fertility since 2007 has been roughly stable, and the biggest decline has been among unmarried women. And so that would be we don't want to overly catastrophize what's happening, but thinking about what we can be doing to help those women who may have had kids out of wedlock or whatever. Now thinking about what can we be doing to make marriage more appealing and attractive, and that will sort of naturally help with our birth rate crunch over the long term.
That's great. So, of course, I think all of us here on the stage have looked at the international context, because there are a lot of countries that have implemented policies. The one that, at least that we know the most about, alas, not Macedonia. We're going to learn about it this morning, but it was Hungary, and Hungary's been very good about talking about it. I joke that if you go to Budapest and get in a taxi, they'll tell you about the family policy programs. And so a lot of us looked at that country and others. And yet, I don't know how to quite generalize it, but I would say at least at the moment, these experiments, sort of modest improvements. I mean, what's your sense? Is there, are we making a mistake thinking about policy, or should this, play some role? It's not the whole role.
No, I think policy has to be part of the solution. I think, especially in the U.S. context, I feel a little bit like we're the John Paul Jones of pronatal policy, where we haven't even begun yet to fight. And so I would love to see more attention paid from this administration, from Congress, to be thinking about support for new parents, pregnant moms. What we can talk about. Your suite of policy proposals. Money can play a role, and Congress is very good at writing checks. So there could be a natural synergy there. At the same time, I think everybody on this panel would agree policy is not the only solution, as we've seen from across the globe. Certainly Europe and other places, they've spent plenty of money, and they haven't. I think modest is probably the most generous way to phrase it. So culture has to play a role too. What can we be doing? Again, the sort of upstream ways in which people are being habituated to think about life and career and all these sort of questions are essential to grapple with. But recognizing that this is primarily a crisis, or not predominantly a crisis of people without a college degree, working class Americans who this administration holds so dearly, trying to think about what is preventing them from forming families. Family policy isn't just about birth, child tax credits and paid leave. It's really a way of thinking about everything from housing policy to, prediction markets, gambling, all these sort of questions that feed into the type of people we are, the type of people we're training our young people to becoming. And once we have that mentality of is this helping or hurting the cause of helping young men and women become young adults who are able to be self-sufficient and start a family, I think that's the shift that we need to make in DC.
So Lyman, I mean, what do you think? So first of all, what's so magical about this number that, at least if the people that have not studied this but have usually heard this idea of this threshold of 2.1 in total fertility? First of all, what does that refer to? Why does that matter so much? And do you think that there's a suite of policies, including financial inducements or at least supports, that might actually lead to an increase in the total fertility?
Yeah, so the word we often hear is replacement rate,
Yes.
which is this really kind of bizarre word. It doesn't sound good, actually.
No.
You're like, what I want is replacement fertility. Like the new model to come along and kick me out. Yeah. That's my kids.
Bad
They're the
branding.
replacements.
Yeah,
It's terrible, right?
yeah.
So, and we say 2.1 because some kids die before they hit puberty. Now, in the U.S., the true replacement rate is 2.02 because not many kids die.
And so this is a ratio of what? It's of number
many
of
kids per
relative
woman.
per woman. Okay.
So, and there's different ways to calculate replacement rate. We can do it from current birth rates for a hypothetical cohort or retrospectively. But regardless, the point is you have to have enough kids to replace both parents after accounting for premature mortality. But the problem with replacement rate is, first of all, it really is terrible branding. What we want to do is hit this random number that we calculated by trying to guess how many of your children will die. Okay,
And
that's
it's
terrible.
a number that nobody can actually meet directly.
Yeah,
No one
exactly.
has 2.1 kids, right?
A friend
Yeah.
just texted this morning that she was having her second kid, and so she was still 0.1 short of replacement.
Not
and I was
there
like,
yet.
it was like,
Yeah.
it's fine. You get to the 0.1 by babysitting a nephew. So it's crazy. So what I've always argued is that we shouldn't think about replacement rate. We should think about the number of kids people want to have. In the U.S., the average is about 2.2, 2.3. It's just above replacement. But nobody says 2.3. They say 2 or 3 or 4 or 1 or 0. And that's also more consistent with basically just individual freedom, right? I don't want to make you
course.
have kids you don't.
Right.
Also, I mean, making people have kids they don't want ends up with a lot of, unintended
Yeah.
and unwanted
Of course.
births.
Or implying that someone that for whatever reason can't or doesn't have above replacement rate
It's like
number.
a bad
Yeah,
person.
exactly.
Yeah,
that we're
yeah.
judging them. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
so I think we should be thinking about hitting what people want. And it's worth noting that in most developed countries, the number that people say they want is higher than replacement.
Yeah.
So the real bar is actually higher. And getting there with policy, as Patrick said, like a policy path to getting the U.S. to 2.2 would be would involve policies I don't think there's any constituency for. You know,
in terms of a voting block of people. Okay.
Right. So, I mean, if you do the spreadsheet math, which is like always dangerous, like, you should never look at a spreadsheet too long. But
It's
I
not
do.
going to increase fertility.
No,
I'm
no, it
absolutely
doesn't.
certain.
It doesn't.
it's the other way.
Yeah. My wife can testify that looking at the spreadsheet too long
does
does not
not
increase.
work.
So, but if you were to be totally spreadsheet brained on this and like use the range of published effect size in the literature, getting the U.S. to replacement rate, which I just said you shouldn't do. But
From where? Where are we right
we're
now?
a bit below 1.6
Okay.
per woman. So that means each generation will be about 20% smaller than the previous one, which means the average person, if you have 101 generation, they will have, I think this is something like 60 grandchildren among them. But getting to replacement, if that's your goal, just with like cash benefits. So basically like, UBI for babies.
You just find what the price is.
Yeah.
and-
What's the price? The answer is it'd be like you'd have to give people a $150,000 check for every baby. And this would cost you something like 2 to 6% of GDP every year, which is a lot. I will note it's less than we spend on Social Security.
Yeah.
So we have government programs bigger than this, but I also think we all recognize you had a baby. Here's a check for $150,000. Might have some bad effects.
Here's $150,000 to have a baby, right?
Yeah. No, I will say it would probably lower abortion rates a whole lot, but I think it might do things to conception behaviors that that might have adverse consequences. Especially, I mean, purely from a health perspective, giving low-income people a $150,000 check to have possibly a high-risk pregnancy. Yeah, I'm not endorsing the idea of the mega baby bonus.
Sure.
I'm pointing out that cash does do something.
Yeah.
Incentives are real.
Yeah, sure.
But you would have to spend a lot to do it just with direct incentive
Right.
policies. But there's other things. Having better housing policy is free. Thinking about educational timing might be free. There's other things we can do policy-wise that might not have a fiscal effect.
So just one follow-up. So what's the space between what people say they want in these surveys, how many kids and how many they do? In other words, and you know this, you've done sociology, and so there's a difference between sort of revealed preferences and things people say. Do you think that those surveys actually reflect, essentially, this is what we would really like to do, but for some impediments that prevent us from doing it?
Among women who marry before age 27, there is no gap between desired fertility and actual fertility. In the latest longitudinal cohort that we have data on, there's no gap if they marry before 27. If you survey people on their desired family size at ages like 18 to 22, so before they have kids, the predictive power of the number they give you is insanely strong. It obliterates the statistical power of religion. It obliterates the statistical power of social class, education. Once you know someone's fertility preferences early in life, nothing else really matters for predicting their fertility except when they get married.
Yes.
So marriage is, as Patrick ably laid out, it is an intrinsically important part of this story. You can't get there without going through marriage. So, but the things people say are super predictive, and if they don't hit their goals, if you look at people, okay, you came in, 2 kids below what you said you wanted, the answers they give on like a standard diagnostic questionnaire of depression, so the CESD is the scale for the nerds curious, are appreciably higher. So people who overshoot or undershoot their desires end up more depressed in mid to late adulthood. And I think that's for the simple reason that all of us, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us have experiences of miscarriage, infertility, failed relationships. The things that cause people to miss their fertility goals are not good things.
Yeah. So Vladko, give us some lessons from Macedonia in particular. I mean, really, there's this kind of philosophical or political question of whether the state actually has an interest in this question. If so, what is it, and why should it have an interest in this question? And what do you think are some of the things that make sense for a state to do in this demographic area?
It does, because there is nothing without humans. We can build everything. We can build the road, economic zones, factories, bridges, this, that. But if there is no people, it's pointless. And in most of Europe, we are in a situation where every year, thousands and thousands of schools are getting closed. And I think a similar thing is coming to America. In America, from all 50 states in the US, all of them have below replacement fertility of 2.1. And that's a Shakespearean to be or not to be. I was seeing the statistics the other day. Right now, there are 65% of the counties in the US that have more deaths than births. So out of 3,144 counties in the US, north of 2,000 have more deaths than births. So that means they're basically dying out. So if there are, God forbid, 2,000 patients in the Walter Reed Hospital here in DC, we'll be all worried. Oh, what can we do? How can we help these people? Well, out there, and the number is going up. 20 years ago, it was much less. It was about 30%, and it's gradually going up and up. So, and the thing with demography is that the population loss is happening gradually and then suddenly. So, for instance, if you see Japan today, as we speak, today in Japan, there'll be 1,900 births, and there'll be 4,400 deaths. So that is 2,500 people lost per day.
Wow.
Per day. That's like 25 airplanes going down every single day. So if, God forbid, a plane goes down today in Japan, or for instance, Germany. Germany last year had 650,000 births and 1 million deaths. So that's daily almost 1,000 people. It's 900 people. Italy has 1,000 births per day and 1,800 deaths. So that's like 8 airplanes going down every single day. So it's dramatic. As I said, if there's a plane down, immediately there'll be a cabinet meeting, maybe a couple of resignations and this and that. And this is happening for literally years and decades, this demographic recession. If there is a recession in Q1, Q2, immediately it's all over the media. And here we are, we have a recession of life, literally for decades. And barely anyone is noticing it. We're all talking about human, resources, mineral resources, oil resources, financial resources, this, that. But the most important resource are the humans, the human resources. And that's people. So coming back, just as a wrap up to all this, the issue is so huge and so big that you can't leave this to the deputy of the assistant in the department of this and that. No, this literally needs to be at the table of president or vice president or prime minister in so many of these countries, because it's existential. It's existential. Also to America, a message. We see where this is going. It's going down further and further and further down. So don't wait for 20 more years, for the things to be much worse than they are now, act now. Even now, we're 20 years late. The last time the U.S. had above replacement for fertility, I think it was in the 1970s. Yes, there was in 2007 almost, it was 2.06, and ever since it's going down. So this is a massive deficit. This is a massive deficit of life. This is a massive recession of life. And I, as someone who is coming from Europe, that's quote, quote, the old continent, I'm bringing a warning a little bit to the new world. That's America. The new world is not that new. You're celebrating 250 this year, as King Charles said, just the other day. Yeah. Yeah. But don't wait for the numbers to be so bad. So start as soon as possible, because I think this is the mother of all crisis. Thank you.
Well, so tell us a bit about the situation in Macedonia specifically, both the demographic situation and what sort of policies you're thinking about.
Macedonia is a small country, just 2 million people. And I became a member of parliament at the age of 27. And I realized, that winning elections is, quote, quote, easy. It's retail politics, it's speeches, it's going to villages, going to towns, handshakes, as you would say in the US, hugging grannies, kissing babies, all that. But then I was realizing in my district, that's Eastern Macedonia, we're massively running out of people. When the
Babies left to kiss.
Yeah, indeed. You see empty schools, not enough workforce, not enough consumers. For so many armies all over the world, also demography is a national security issue, because you're running out of people. So I've realized, okay, we can win the elections, but we can, lose lose the people. And then I started digging into numbers and seeing what's happening. So yeah, we worked a lot on this issue. Between 2006 and 2016, Macedonia was the only country in Southern Europe, from Portugal to Spain, Italy, all over the Balkans, like Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Croatia, that increased the number of births. Not much, 2.3%. But still, everyone else was going down, like 5%, 10%, 21%. Some of these countries are going down. We've increased the number of third-born children 40%, 39 to be exact. So 40% of third-born children. So that's huge. So just as a wrap-up, demography is as complicated as the economy, even more. There is a lot of psychology in demography. In order for the GDP to grow up, you need to have foreign investment, domestic investment, efficient courts, good demography, low taxes, economic zones, like 20 things in the pipeline, and then the GDP grows 2, 3, 4%. It's a similar thing in demography. But there is no silver bullet, but there is also a lot of psychology. So we literally need to reach the hearts and the minds of the new generation. Nowadays, for a baby to be born, it needs to be born here and it needs to be born here. So we need to figure out the way, including culture and all the things that were mentioned here, but it is a worthy cause. It's a great thing. It's the miracle of life. Yes. And the purpose of our existence, it's life wins over death. And the life triumphs when a little baby opens its eyes, and then, from that branch, there'll be new branches, that will be our voice in eternity.
Wonderful. That's a perfect transition to you, Carrie, because we've implied this, that ideas and culture play a major role in this, and that's most of your work has been upstream from these sort of detailed policy discussions and demographic discussions. You focused a lot on the kind of intellectual background of the West, and in particular the role of feminism in the sexual revolution. And then this most recent book called Something Wicked. Something's going to be interesting if that's the name of the book. But talk a little bit about the kind of cluster of ideas you focused on and the role that you think it plays in the symptoms that we're talking about here.
No, I think you're exactly right. It is the mother of all issues that we're dealing with, and that sort of captures, I think, what part of the problem is that I've done all this research going back to the very beginning of feminism, 1792, kind of the start of it, and and seeing the progression and what it is that's been happening with women in the minds and the hearts and what's transitioned. And without boring you with all the details of Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Margaret Sanger and on, I think that there's something really important that we can distill about their ideas. And one of them was the very felt need to try to help and protect women from abusive men or abusive situations. That was really the goal. The problem is, though, that they did not use the right medicine for solving that problem. I think if you look around the world today, you can still see that we have the problem of abusive men and women who are not being treated well. So that hasn't been fixed. But what has changed is our understanding of human anthropology. So we went from the Judeo-Christian principles from Genesis, He created them, God created them male and female. They are made in the image and likeness of God. Both are good, and they're meant to be fruitful and multiply and serve one another. That was sort of the old point of view. And I think what feminism brought in very, very subtly, very, very slowly, is something quite different. And I think when I say it, you will see a lot of the kind of remnants of it in the culture. But I think this is really at the heart of why it is that we're not having children. And much of it is because feminism has preached this gospel of men are contemptible and women need to be just like them. It's this very bizarre vortex. It's fascinating to actually look at it. So what's coming from that? Well, it's certainly a sense of condemnation for men. This is not holding up the incredible gifts that men have and that they bring to culture. I think we've even sort of become blind to what those are in our culture today. But at the same time, it also is this incredible amount of envy and women feeling like they need to be something that they're actually not made to be. And that's not to say that women aren't gifted or that women shouldn't work or any of those things. But Margaret Thatcher said, you cannot build anything with envy. And I think this is the problem that we're seeing is this sort of crumbling of relationships because of the fact that there's this constant divide and aggravation and frustration because men aren't being appreciated and women don't really understand their purpose. And the amazing thing too is to just see how much feminism has tracked with certainly the French Revolution, then socialism, and then finally with communism. And you can really see how destructive it is. It can only really break things down. It can't actually build. And I think this is really where we have an opportunity to start getting back to what is this idea of Genesis, from the beginning, that vision. But I think it's also important to really understand just even the role of motherhood in all of this. We kind of think of motherhood as sort of like you can get a driver's license or something. Like you can do it if you want. It's not something that has to be any part of your identity. And yet, when we understand that all women are actually created for motherhood, not just biological motherhood, but for a kind of care and life bringing to the culture, to our communities, to our churches, to our states and beyond, then suddenly everything kind of shifts because women have a responsibility, they have a duty, they have a goal, and I think that's one of the things that's happened is we've left women kind of adrift without a sense of purpose other than focusing on how do they kind of bubble wrap themselves from vulnerability. And part of that obviously is to have enough money that you don't have to rely on other people, to really even the goal of a career. I know when I was growing up, there was something very humiliating to me about saying, I want to get married, I want to have children, because we've made that it's something that women can't control. You have to wait for someone to ask you on a date. You have to wait for someone to ask you to marry you. And so it feels very out of our control when we've had this environment of control that women have really been indoctrinated by deeply, I think, certainly in the last 50 or 60 years. So I think that's just a key piece, that if we can start shifting that sense, that motherhood is good, it goes far beyond biological motherhood, and it's something that can actually be enrich your life in the workplace, in your relationships, all of those things that I think women are really struggling with. And this is why we're seeing so much anxiety and depression in the culture, is because of this, this real sense of being lost.
So, since you're a philosopher, I'd like to just ask you to explain what you mean by the sexual revolution, because we all use that term. I'll say what I mean when I use it is something like the idea that sex, marriage, and childbirth should be detached rather than having them as an organic whole culturally and conceptually. I mean, how do you think of the sexual revolution?
Well, one of the things that's was really interesting in my research was to even see just the role of feminism in the sexual revolution, and I think that's very. I think what you've described is right. The sense of detaching all of those pieces that people understood as coming together, but you can't look past that idea of the role of women are meant to be just like men in feminism, and the promotion of promiscuity and that idea of liberation that was supposed to come from it. And I think that's part of the problem, though, is that we have to account for women's fertility, and this, of course, is where abortion comes into it, and where we can see feminism really is this engine behind abortion, because women are told that it's gets in the way of their careers and goals, while at the same time being told that they need to be promiscuous. I think that's a great description of it. I think there's all kinds of tentacles to it, but the idea that we can break men and women out of these deep relationships and make us all individuals, and it becomes about self-expression and sexual pleasure and whatever identity you want to create, I think that kind of encompasses the sexual revolution as well.
So Patrick, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you talked about the centrality of marriage in this whole thing. So if we were thinking not just about these very difficult cultural questions, which I think require something like cultural renewal and spiritual renewal probably, but just the question of marriage itself, if we were going to make a case for that, do we need to be focusing on men, on women, on kids, on changing the narrative about marriage? I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is in some respects the question that lies at so much of the heart of what we're seeing around the globe and here in the U.S. And I think it's important, as conservatives, I think we all agree with at least with some degree with Carrie, ideas have consequences. We can trace these sort of intellectual movements and how they influence the culture, but we also believe that people respond to incentives. And what I think it's my claim would be that what you have to, as we become richer as a society and as people are more economically self-sufficient today, or if you're a young single adult than maybe you were, if you're a school teacher in Odessa, Texas in 1920, your sort of opportunities to consume are pretty limited, right? Your pool of potential mates is pretty limited. You can move to New York, you can be on the dating apps, you can travel the world, all these sort of things. There's a lot more that you are able to provide for yourself on your own, thanks to rising educational attainment and rising wages and all these sort of things. And so marriage, again, partially an economic story, partially a cultural story, is now less essential. It used to be the only place you could have a sort of socially sanctioned partner for sex and childbearing and sharing household resources and economies of scale, all these sort of things that were sort of a bundle of goods and services that used to be exclusive to marriage. I think the sexual revolution was about debundling marriage and sort of saying, well, now we have apps for that, right, or something like this. Part of our project, and I'm thinking of Robert Rector's work here and others on the conservative side of the aisle, has been thinking about, well, how can we sort of restore some social status to marriage that makes it appealing to people, maybe some economic benefits as well. We can talk about marriage bonuses and that sort of thing, to make it appealing in a way that makes it better than just the sum of its parts. And so I think that's part of the conversation that we're trying to have here, but also recognizing that if people aren't marrying for money or to preserve the royal bloodline or whatever they used to do to the things that got them into marriage in the first place in the pre-sexual revolution days. Now it's more about companionship and interpersonal relations and attentiveness, and I think this is where the breakdown in marriage is happening if you look along class lines, because college-educated Americans used to get married at lower rates than non-college educated makers. Now, women in their 40s are about 10 percentage points more likely to have been married than non-college, and that gap continues to grow. And so something's going wrong with, again, working class, blue collar Americans. They're not finding each other, and they're not finding each other as appealing. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for us, to try to figure out what we can do to kind of form them in that way.
And of course, and Robert Rector's talked for many years about the marriage penalties in our means-tested welfare program. And so but those are people that are in those programs. You're talking about people that have incomes presumably in jobs, but are lower middle class or something like that. That's the kind of key demographic where we're falling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Robert's been sounding the bell on this for many years. I wish more in Congress would focus on this. The problem is that takes money, or at least some creative approaches to thinking about how you can smooth the cliff, right? If you're cohabitating and you say, well, we're going to lose Section 8 or Medicaid or TANF if we actually, put a ring on it, that's a huge disincentive. Maybe not, it doesn't explain the whole gap. It's a couple percentage points overall, but those things add up. And it requires policymakers here in D.C. to care about it as a problem and just not just pay lip service to, oh, isn't marriage great? Because marriage is great, but we're sort of in a situation where it's to those who have, more will be given in forms of benefits of marriage, and those who don't, more will be taken away from them. And I think that's a terrible recipe for not just birth rates, but social cohesion overall, rates of loneliness, polarization, all the rest.
Yeah. Well, so Lyman, I mean, you've been thinking and writing and working on this for years, and you mentioned briefly the sort of difficulty of, okay, we know there's some financial threshold at which you could induce people that might otherwise.
There's some price.
Yeah, there's some price up there. I do wonder if it's 150, maybe even be higher. But I mean, do you think that there is a politically saleable way of doing certain policies that, of course, there's sort of three kinds of policies. There's what can we do to get rid of marriage penalties that actually punishes it? What can we do in the economy to improve things like the affordable housing and things like this? But then also, are there things that we can do to directly support family formation specifically? Is there some threshold in there that's not this sort of outrageous price that could work?
So there are several countries that have fallen below replacement rate fertility and have risen back above. Georgia is an example.
The country of Georgia.
The country, yeah.
Yes.
Israel never fell below replacement. They've just stayed above it.
Way above it, right?
Yeah, they're like 3. And then we have Dan Hess in the audience, so I have to mention Kazakhstan, his beloved case. And there's others that have fallen close. But what they all have in common is that the government wasn't like, here's some money for a baby. We're not going to tell you what it's for. They all were cases where the country said, this is so you have babies. There's no way to do stealth natalism. It doesn't happen. So governments have to talk about this, but that means that how they talk about it ends up mattering. Going to a South Korean teenager and saying, you need to have babies because if you don't, we're going to lose when North Korea invades. So have a baby so we can put them on the front lines.
Not great.
Terrible pitch. So having, intuitively, but then also I can say having focus grouped this, done randomized survey tests on this, the message that works is, you want kids. You do. Yeah. You know that the reason you're not, the reason you feel you're not having them is these cost barriers, whatever. Okay, that's fair. I mean, we had that New York Times article where it's like the cost barriers. I don't want to stop golfing so much. And I'm like, feels like a cultural barrier more than a cost barrier. But you feel like it's a cost barrier. But do you know what the consequence of your choice will be for you in the future? Not for the age pyramid, not for the recruitable population, not for have one for the GDP is a terrible pitch. Australia actually tried this. They had a family minister who was like, have one for mom, one for dad, and one for the country. And I'm like, oh, no. The pitch that actually works empirically is telling people, look, you might have a hard couple of years, but if you look at people in your position who made the choice not to have those kids, when they get into their 40s, the people who have fewer kids than they said they want have vastly higher rates of depression, vastly higher rates of regret for their life. They have worse outcomes on every single thing we can measure, and that's true even if you control for a bunch of life history factors. Failed IVF is associated with a doubling of prescribing of antidepressants and antipsychotics. Delaying this choice will hurt you. you're going to love being a parent. The best predictor of someone raising the number of kids they want is having a kid. When you have a kid, you discover they're like better than you expected. They look more like your spouse than you, and you like them better than you would have. The pitch for the public is not about the needs of the country. It's about what's good for you. And I know that sounds selfish. It's like, oh, we're feeding into a culture of selfishness. Yes, we are. Also, such is the landscape. Now, I think that there's a related question. I'm like leaping off script here, but because we have the opportunity of having our Macedonian colleague here, the rebuttal we often get is about immigration, right? Couldn't we solve these problems with immigration? Yes. And I think this is one reason to point out the real problem is not the age pyramid. It's the experience of people who would have otherwise been parents. Immigration, no amount of immigrants next door is a substitute for me not having a kid I wanted.
And the one thing we're good at assimilating immigrants to is our birth rates.
Yes, we're very good at that. Yeah. But I want to say, like, I wonder how my Macedonian colleague would feel if Germany said, we don't know how to raise the birth rate. Instead, we want to solve this by giving a special program for all the Macedonian young people to move to Germany. Would you feel like that's a good solution for the birth rate problem, or would you maybe feel like that's not a great solution for Germany's birth rate problem?
It's happening all over Europe. You know, it's a quote-unquote battle for human resources, and we're a country that literally for years and decades is bleeding people. You know,
and it's not a fair fight either.
Exactly. No. I mean, on one side you have BMW and VW, and the other side you have, you know, our economy that simply can't. It's not a match for that. So, and the consequence of that is not just the macroeconomics and all that. It's also you have all these countless grandmas and grandfathers that have not seen their grandchildren or their children for 5 years. You know, they're in Germany, they're in Scandinavia, they're in the US, they're in Canada. You know, it's basically cannibalizing the human resources of the country that is affected by people leaving the country.
And we never get that perspective when we talk about this in the US or the UK or Germany. We say, oh, immigrants can solve this. And nobody asks, what happens to these countries where we've filtered off the 10, 20% most talented young people for 2 generations? Anyways, that's off topic, but I just felt it was a later event. It was worth bringing up. We have such an opportunity because we always do this just in countries that are net receivers.
Yes, absolutely. Patrick, you had a brief intervention.
I was just going to illustrate Lyman's point with an anecdote I heard from a rival think tank across town. They were doing some focus groups with young adults, and they said, picture your life in your 30s. Describe what that looks like. And they say, oh, I'm going to have a great job. I'm going to have a great career. I'm going to be traveling the world, all that sort of stuff. And they say, describe your life in your 60s. And they say, I want to be surrounded by my grandkids. And it's like, there's a mismatch here. We have to think how the grandkids are going to pop out of nowhere. So those conversations about recognizing the long-term vision and helping people realize that you know, it takes time to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's another thing, you know, for many literally centuries, these small villages with high fertility, they were filling the big towns. But now these villages, you know, they have 20, 30, 40 grannies, you know, and the average age is 60, 70. So there are not anymore too many of these demographic reservoirs to feed the big cities that have low fertility. And it's also the same thing for the small towns. And what's happening also in the quote-unquote new world is also a rapid collapse of fertility in the last 10 years in Latin America. You know, if you see Puerto Rico, if you see Colombia, Chile, you know, Santiago de Chile or Bogota now have the fertility rate of East Asian cities. Mexico, for the first time, has a lower fertility than the US. Canada has ultra low fertility rate of 1.1, you know, and so for instance, Canada back in the 1960s with 13 million people had 360,000 babies, and Canada with 40 million people, 40, they have also 360,000 babies. So this is massive. So in this regard, as I said, it's a huge issue, you know, like literally when you start to dive, you know, into this river, it's not a river, it's not even a sea, it's a literally ocean of data, processes, numbers, and trends.
So, Vleko, if President Trump watching the live stream here, hello, yes,
He's tweeting through it.
Yes, exactly. The White House called and said, "What would you do if you were the president of the United States or the federal government?" Because the president's powers are limited. But if you could sort of advise a very large country, the United States of America, given your experiences in Macedonia.
First, I think this can and should be a bipartisan issue. Because, for instance, in Europe, just in the last 2 years, for instance, you have the Prime Minister of Malta. He's from a Labour Party, center left. He said, "Oh, we need more babies because Malta has the lowest fertility rate in Europe." Then you have the Macron, Emmanuel Macron, France. He said, "Oh, we need more babies." He's coming from the liberal centrist political party. You have a Labour Minister of Education in the UK from the current government of Keir Starmer, and she wrote an article for The Independent last year saying, "Oh, our schools are closing, we're running off people." Then you had the London City Council 2 months ago saying, "Oh, we're becoming a quote-unquote childless city," and the London City Council and the mayor are coming from the left green area. Then you have the government of Norway. They're also progressive left. They're saying, "Oh, we need to figure out about this." So first, I think this needs to be a bipartisan issue, just like in South Korea, the country with the lowest fertility rate in in the world. And for the U.S., it should be bipartisan. And I've seen a number of statements from the administration officials saying, "Oh, we need more babies." So I think both the president, the vice presidents, the cabinet ministers, for instance, the Secretary of Transportation was talking about this. Also, I think Secretary of Health Kennedy was speaking about this a couple of months ago. So I think there is a growing awareness in the U.S., but at the same time, U.S. should avoid the mistake of so many countries that have spent big billions and gazillions without a result. So, for instance, South Korea spent $270 billion between 2006 and 2021. Without results. Germany, north of 200 billion euros, that's more than $200 billion. Greece, Japan, and so on and so forth. So the magic formula of this is not to spend too much money. Second, to have the results. And to be inclusive, because we need to speak with the woman and the man and the young people in a not judgmental way. At the end of the day, it's a personal choice. When you're going to have your child, how many, in which circumstances. Every human is a universe for itself. So in that regard, as I said, yes, we need to think about the big numbers, but we also need to think about the every human soul that is very super unique.
That's terrific. So, Carrie, I've heard you talk about the way in which sort of a century of progressive policy has allowed the state to substitute many of the roles that were traditionally accorded to the father. And in fact, I've heard you use this term bureaugamy. Talk a bit about that, because of course there's ideas, but there are also policies that slowly cause this problem.
Yeah, I wish I had coined this term of bureaugamy, but I did not. But I think it's very apt, because what has happened is that there's so many women who have children, and then they have needs to support those children, but there aren't fathers in there, so the state ends up having to raise the children. And I think that this obviously has so many different ramifications for the state itself, the way that women vote, the way that they see their fertility in the family, and their children. And so I think that has a huge role that we've really underestimated. I think the other important thing that we've underestimated as well is just even the idea of mimesis, of what it's like to actually see people, other women with children, and
mimesis. Mimesis,
Renee Girard's idea of mimesis, and this idea of modeling what it's like. Most of the advertising that we see today is not with women with children, and women are very dialed into that. Like, I can't even see myself having children because I can't relate to anyone that I know that's had them. I just don't see myself in that at all. And then to compound that, you also have the problem, and I have 5 children, of conveying, those special tender moments. It's very easy for me to film my children when they're behaving badly, and that's generally what we see advocacy and advertising. And so I think we have a lot of work that can be done there as well in terms of helping people really understand the beauty of it, and also just what it does for women. One of the earliest books that I wrote was really about this idea of how the difficulties of motherhood are not a flaw; they're actually a feature, because it requires you to put someone above yourself, and obviously that can only be a win for a family. It can only be a win for society when you have people acting in a sacrificial way and caring for others, and moving beyond this sort of selfish, nasal gazing, navel, not nasal.
Nasal
That's
gazing,
very
that's
hard to
bad
do.
too.
It's,
Yeah.
it's very hard to do. Navel gazing that I think we've created in the culture. So I think there's a lot of ways, and I'd actually be really interested to hear if what's being done in terms of advertising and influencers and trying to create models that women can see themselves actually having children instead of feeling like they're going to be tossed, out of the world in which they've lived and known for most of their life.
Well, so we're just almost at the end, so I'm going to ask for a lightning round of no more than 30 seconds per panelist, and I'll start with you, Patrick. Had to warn, everybody else gets a little time, so you'll have to sort of jump on this. But if you could, if there's one thing that we haven't said, or a key thing that people don't think about that you think is really important if you're on an elevator and you wanted to explain this, what would that be?
I'm going to do something that I don't know if has ever been done before at the Heritage Foundation, but say something positive about Harvard University. To Carrie's point, they just announced they're expanding their stipends for graduate students who have kids by, I think it was $6,000. That is the kind of putting your money where your mouth is that we need to have more women, more men thinking about making it compatible to have kids, to pursue careers, all these sort of things. Recognizing that parents have costs that non-parents don't, that's the number one thing we can be doing.
Great. Latko?
Each and every one of us in this room has 2 parents. We have 4 grandparents. We have 8 grand-grandparents, and then 16, and then 32, 64, and all the way. So in just 10 generations, I think, in 300 years, it's about 1,000 ancestors. Think about them. It was not easy for them. It was not easy for them. They were, some of them were literally hungry. Some of them are literally, they were giving their food to their offspring. So they were thinking about us, they were praying about us, they were contemplating about us. And today, we're gonna say, I got too many emails, I have a stress, I need to answer too many messages, and let alone back then they had child mortality of 50, 60, 70%. So therefore, it's up to our generation. We need to continue this cycle of life. So the tree of life needs to have more branches.
Wonderful. Carrie?
I would just say that I think that there's this trend that's so heartening of particularly younger women being open to the idea of motherhood, being open to more traditional marriage. Even Jessie Buckley, who won the Academy Award, I watched the movie Hamnet, and I didn't love it. I actually wrote a review about it, but what she won was a woman crying after her son dies. Sorry, I just spoiled it for you. But in any event, the point being that I think women have gone to this place where they feel like they're kind of like in this cubicle experience of their own soul, and they want something bigger. They want something deeper. They want to stretch themselves emotionally and with all that life has to offer, instead of just this very controlled, sterile kind of environment that we've created for so many women. And so I think we can have a lot of hope from that perspective as well.
Wonderful. Lyman?
I feel like we've all been very on brand with like our last comments here. Like higher education is good. Young people need to toughen up. So I'll stick on brand for me, which is in my experience, the number one obstacle to getting anything done policy-wise on this is that a lot of policymakers really believe there's nothing to be done. And the culture argument this is basically the culture argument. It's just culture. There's nothing we can do. This kind of wimpy defeatism, I think, is an embarrassment to hear coming out of your lips. I think you should be ashamed of even thinking that there's nothing to be done to save the human species. And furthermore, it represents genuine, just like low IQ in numeracy. There is so much to be done. There are so many policies that we know have effects. The effects may not be big, but the reality is right now we don't know what policy is going to save humanity, but we know a lot that could buy us a few more years of time to figure it out. not doing that, not sticking your finger in the dike just because you know a bigger wave is coming. Well, yeah, if you stop a little bit of leak now, maybe somebody else has time to solve the bigger problem. We should do the things that we know work right now. And if they don't fully solve the problem, so what? We have bought our descendants time to figure it out. Failure to do that is a betrayal of the next generation. Our ancestors thought of us. We should think of them and buy them the time with, yeah, child allowance is expensive, modest effect. We should do them anyway. You know, better parental leave. You know, modest effects, probably do it anyway. Solving marriage penalties, is it going to revitalize marriage? Probably not. Do it anyway. We should do these things because they are good on their own right and they buy us time to save the rest of civilization.
Perfect ending. Please join me in thanking our panel, all of you. You need your mic right here. Well, I am delighted to introduce first my colleague, Roger Severino, who's the Vice President of Economic and Domestic Policy here at the Heritage Foundation, and really the instigator and the force behind this, certainly at Heritage. I still remember the first meeting that we had about it. And he is going to be joined by Senator Jim Banks, who is from this great state of Indiana. So let me just briefly introduce Senator Banks, and then we'll welcome to the stage. Senator Banks was the first in his family to go to college, and he graduated from Indiana University, where he met his wife, Amanda. He later earned a Master of Business Administration from Grace College. Senator Banks is also a U.S. Navy veteran. In 2015 and 16, Senator Banks took a leave of absence from the Indiana State Senate to deploy to Afghanistan during Operations Enduring Freedom and Freedom Sentinel. Before being elected to the U.S. Senate in 2024, Banks served in the United States House of Representatives and in the Indiana State Senate. While serving in the Indiana State Senate from 2010 to 2016, he chaired the Senate Veterans Affairs and Military Committee. Before coming to Washington, Senator Banks served as president of the Columbia City Rotary Club, chairman of the Whitley County Republican Party, and a member of the Whitley County Council and Northeast Indiana Workforce Development Board. So public service is clearly in his blood. Senator Banks and his wife Amanda are the parents of 3 daughters. Please join me in welcoming Roger Severino and Senator Jim Banks.
Senator, thank you for coming.
Yeah, good morning.
This is
Great to be here.
Wonderful. We got a great crew. We've been talking policy this morning, a lot of numbers, the demographic crisis, the marriage crisis, et cetera. I want to take it to a personal level. You're happily married, Amanda Banks, who herself is a force of nature, wonderful. You have 3 children. You're a son of a factory worker and a nursing home cook, the first college grad in your family, right? You married relatively young, and nowadays the average age of marriage is getting closer to 30. You have 3 children, which is above the average by a good measure now. That entailed risk, a leap of faith that so many young people are afraid of now. What was the difference maker for you in your life?
I don't think we really thought about it. I'm a pretty average person in a lot of ways, and the average age of marriage in 1960 was 22 years old. My parents were married when they were 21. My grandparents got married when they were 17 and 19 or 20. My grandpa joined the Army and they deployed, so they got married. My grandma is still alive today. I've been blessed all my life with young. My parents are 68 years old, and my grandma's still alive today, so I've been blessed with young parents and grandparents all my life. And my wife and I got married when we were 25, which felt like that at that time. You know, we've been married for just over 20 years. At that point, it felt like we were getting married a little bit later than a lot of people that we knew. My brother got married before he could legally drink, and he had went on to have 6 kids. He sadly passed away last summer, but he has 6 kids, a great legacy. My wife and I got married when we were 25. after college. We met at Indiana University in the College Republicans. Some say that's why I got involved in politics. And she moved first to Colorado Springs right after college. I literally chased her there to pursue her, and we went to work had the blessing of working for Dr. Dobson at Focus on the Family, and we got married. 25 years old. We have 3 teenage daughters. Let me tell you, raising teenage daughters is harder than anything I've ever had to do in Washington, D.C. Hanging out with crazy radicals in the Senate pales in comparison to raising teenage daughters, but it's all worth it. I mean, the average age of marriage today, though, is 29, almost 30. And you think about if that's the average, then how many couples are getting married later than that? And there's only so much time that God blesses us here with a fertility clock to have kids, and the decline in fertility is real, and it has a lot to do with that statistic right there. And then the other statistics that I look at, Roger, are the divorce rates in our country. More than half of families in the country are divorced. Only 47% of households are 2-parent families with kids, and you know that statistic is startling too. But to answer your question, I don't think we really thought about it. We both grew up in homes and knew that my parents, they working class, blue collar, they struggled. My grandparents came from true poverty on my dad's side, and but you look at trends and statistics, and my wife and I know that we're better off. Even on those hard days, we know that our daughters are better off, we're better off, and now as a policymaker, I look at those trends and statistics. I'm really concerned. I'm glad Heritage is leading the way and doing something about it.
Now, turning a bit to policy, so this is America's 250th birthday, and people would be perhaps surprised to know that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had on average 6 children, right? And right now we're about 1.6 per woman. Is there a role for government, the federal government in particular, you're a senator, to address this question? Because we have some folks who say, well, these are life choices, that government's role isn't about those sorts of personal decisions. Others say children are in essence something like a public good. The goodness that comes from them spills over into greater society. Some people think it's going to be too expensive. Some say it's not going to do much. There are ideas all over the place as to whether or not government should even have a role in this. What do you think?
Yeah, when I first got involved in politics, late 90s, early 2000s, my daughters, by the way, joke about how my wife and I came from the 1900s. When we first got involved in politics, I mean, it was the culture war, right? We were fighting for the sanctity of marriage, the important pro-life causes, and those are still really important. Since I've been in Washington, we went through the radical woke era of the left. But I think one thing I've learned, Roger, and Heritage has been so good about this, recognizing that the culture war and the social issues, when it comes to all of that, economic policy is cultural and has a lot to do with the social causes too. They're directly related. They're directly interlinked, and the federal government has a real role to play here. And over the years, we've had debates in Congress. This was hard for. I spent a lot of time thinking about the new right, the new Republican Party versus the old Republican Party, the old establishment, and how President Trump has remapped, reframed American politics for the next generation. And as we're entering into the second half of his second term, what does that post-Trump era look like, and how can the Republican Party keep this large voting bloc that gives us majorities and win the White House with voters that weren't traditional Republican voters? And it has a lot to do with all of this, and what President Trump has taught us. And I think back the old school Republican Party, free markets, the globalist that sold out a lot of those working class jobs, like the one that my dad is a retired union factory worker. And I think in my childhood, NAFTA was a 4-letter word. my dad hated politicians and politics, but there were two candidates for president that he loved. Ross Perot, we had the bumper sticker on the pickup truck. I was embarrassed about it at the time, but now I get it. Why my dad was aligned with that. I mean, he worked in a factory and could feel it. And then he never got excited about another candidate until Donald Trump came down the escalator. He was for him on day one. And I argued with my dad about it. My dad was right. And he was looking for that type of candidate that would protect his job and his livelihood and his culture, where he came from, a culture, an American culture where hard work means something. Go to work every day to put food on the table. When I was born, we lived in a trailer park. My mom was a nursing home cook for 30 years, and my dad worked in the same factory and retired from it with a good pension and health care, and took something away from it. And now I'm in Washington in this Trump era, and President Trump is speaking to voters just like my dad about how we can create policies at the federal level to help people like him more than ever before. The old school Republican Party would sell him out, and the new Republican Party, the new conservative movement, the Heritage is leading the way on this front, understands the importance of. When I first got to Washington, child tax credits were really controversial on the right. Is that the role of federal? Is that a conservative policy? Well, what as conservatives, what's more important than conserving the family? And child tax credits, I think, were kind of it opened the door to an understanding that pro-family tax policy and economic policy is critical to protecting and conserving the family, which is the family is fundamental to the survival of our country and our American culture. So, you guys have a lot of really good ideas, and you guys are talking about smart ideas today, and I don't belong in those conversations, but I'm reading what you're working on, what Heritage is working on, and talking about expanding, creating new tax provisions for families, for newlyweds. You and I have worked on legislation together to create school choice for childcare. I mean, this is I get questions at home all the time. But what are you doing to bring down the cost of childcare? Because it's too darn expensive to have. You have a lot of families work. Both mom and dad go to work all day. Some of them work more than one job, and then they got to pay for just to afford getting by. Then rising childcare costs on top of that. Not to mention all the other things that we have to pay for, high gas prices and groceries. But Heritage is coming up with unique ideas that literally nobody else in Washington, D.C. is thinking about, to come up with ideas for Trump savings accounts like provisions for newlyweds and choice for school choice for childcare. These are really good ideas that directly help new families that I think will go a long way to encouraging younger couples to get married younger, have kids younger, and preserve this great country as our founders imagined.
And you mentioned President Trump, who one of his campaign planks was to help the nuclear family. And of course, Vice President Vance has been all about family policy. So we're seeing a change in tone from the top. And you mentioned old school Republican Party, et cetera. Something that I always found curious, now we're nonpartisan here, but married voters tend to vote more Republican than non-married, yet you don't see that many Republican politicians saying we need more pro-marriage policies. And you're a bit of an exception to that. Right now, marriage is seen a bit like a luxury good, that it's out of reach for people, that it's too expensive. What are your thoughts, and say any advice you have for young people who think that somehow marriage is out of reach? And are there policy solutions that we need to put forward to address that affordability crisis that people think, you know what, I need to have all my ducks in a row and then I'm worthy of marriage. Because I don't think that's what the path you pursued. You got your MBA well after you got married, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think about what is the statistic? Marriage is like you talk about the American dream, and my mom and dad's idea. I mean, growing up in a trailer, living in a trailer park, and my mom and dad worked hard I have two younger brothers. They worked hard to put food on the table, and my mom and dad's American dream was that each of the three of their boys would grow up and have a better shot, have something more than what they had. And my mom and dad saw the American dream, and I've lived the American dream. I mean, I've seen it. But I think there's a statistic that 98% of married couples exceed poverty rates, or what's a better way to say that? That it's like like marriage is the silver bullet to avoid poverty. So, as policymakers and as smart people who are involved in policy, like how could we not go there to solve all of the big issues that our country faces? Then recognize that we need to incentivize and promote marriage and family in this great country, and it's sort of the silver bullet for all of our problems. And you guys are coming up with smart ideas on ways to do that. I mean, we talked, when it comes to tax policy, and we just did the big beautiful bill. We expanded the child tax credit a little bit. You talk about when I was a kid, I didn't grow up in a house where don't take this the wrong way. I hope my parents worked hard, but I didn't grow up in a house where I'm going to inherit a lot. But my parents, they did everything they could to buy a home and pay off a mortgage and have a little bit of something to pass on to the kids. But I grew up in a place where I would hear about inheritance tax and think that's for rich people, but it's really not. I mean, the inheritance tax is for blue collar, working class Americans who grow up and think they want to pass something on to their kids, and then they get a tax hit for it. So inheritance taxes, eliminating marriage penalty taxes. These are all things that Heritage has worked on for years, but in this new era, the ideas that you guys are coming up with are really novel ideas and significant that are going to go a long ways in this next generation to help families even more. And I'm excited to be a part of that.
And there's competing ideas, right? On the full spectrum of government should do nothing to government should do a crash program to create artificial wombs. So in 20 years, we could just solve the problem that way. Other folks think that immigration could be the solution, or government subsidized egg freezing and IVF. We're on the side of try to make it easier for people to get married earlier and restorative reproductive medicine, et cetera. So we have all these competing visions as to how we can address the problem. What do you have to say to those who think, you know what, let's just immigrate our way out of the problem, or technological solutions instead of, I don't know, how God intended?
Well, the studies show that mass migration, and I hear this all the time, big corporate CEOs or chamber of commerce types, the business community, well, we just need more labor. So whether they're in favor of turning a blind eye to illegal immigration and the crisis that we faced because of the Biden era, or they just want to loosen all of the standards and rules for work visas and legal immigration to flood more labor. I hear this all the time, and in the old days it was more convincing, but now I think President Trump has shown us that twofold. I think first of all, the studies show that in the second generation of legal immigration, that waves that come into our country, that their fertility rates come down to the same low fertility rates of everybody else. But then secondly, what mass migration does to eliminate those solid, good paying, blue-collar jobs like factory workers, or one industry that I'm really concerned about that's really important to Indiana is the trucking industry. It's been completely taken over by legal and illegal immigrants who have taken over the trucking industry. Causes a lot of other dangerous issues as well, but at the end of the day, what has been allowed to happen in this country has taken a lot of really, I mean, those trucking jobs can be six-figure jobs, but a lot of those jobs have been taken away from Americans and given to legal and illegal immigrants who have taken over that industry. And what that does to the effect that has on families and working-class blue-collar America is real. So we have to look at the effect that has on families as well.
Any final words of encouragement, right? America 250 now, the family's a bit on the ropes. What gives you hope for the next 250?
My hope is in all of you. As a policymaker and as a, you know, when I'm going to sporting events with my daughters play soccer and track and cheerleading, and I go to these sporting events, and I'm at this age where I'm starting to feel old. But when I get on a plane and fly to Washington, D.C. and enter the United States Senate, I feel pretty young. And I plan on doing it for a while. It's an important job, and I feel God has called me to be here to be a part of this mission and this fight. And what I'm really hungry for right now more than ever is good ideas. And what you guys are doing here today is producing some really good policy ideas that deserve debate in the Congress that can help families. And like I said before, I was always a social conservative first, concerned about our culture and what type of America are we turning over to our kids. But now I'm more convinced than ever that these pro-family causes are directly impacted by economic issues like what all of you are discussing. So keep coming up with good ideas and passing them on to me and a growing number of members in the House and the Senate who are thinking differently as conservatives than what Republicans and conservatives thought about before, about these issues, because we have a ripe moment in this new era to advance causes that are really good for families. We also look abroad, right? I mean, you and I were talking a little bit ago about other countries that we can learn from that have seen their fertility rates rebound and marriage rates increase, and we can look around and find some good ideas and study other countries. But we all know at the end of the day, America is going to lead, and we have everything that we need right here at home to rebuild the foundation of our country and our American culture, and that comes from the family.
Wonderful way to end our conversation. Senator Banks, you are a champion for the family in the Senate, and you live the life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next part of our program is our Heritage All-Star Panel. I will be moderating it and also being a speaker on it. We have Delano Squires, Emma Waters, and Rachel Sheffield. Delano Squires is director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Human Flourishing. He focuses on policies and social norms that promote marriage, fatherhood, and healthy families. He's the author of the forthcoming book, The Vanishing Black Family: How Welfare and Feminism Made Marriage Optional and Children Vulnerable. We also have Rachel Sheffield, who is a research fellow in welfare and family policy at Heritage. She focuses on reforming the nation's welfare system, examines how trends in marriage and family connect to social mobility, and has also written issues such as foster care reform, homelessness, educational choice, and child nutrition programs. Finally, we have Emma Waters, who's a senior policy analyst in the Center for Technology and Human Person at the Heritage Foundation. Her work focuses on family, biotechnology, and reproductive medicine. She's a former visiting fellow with the Independent Women's Forum. She's wonderful in that she exemplifies how family-friendly Heritage is, where I remember seeing her not too long ago giving a presentation here with a child tugging at her pant leg, and we love babies here at Heritage. So please welcome our three panelists, Emma, Delano, and Rachel. It was a wonderful chat with Senator Banks, and he did mention a lot of the heritage policies that we've been working on for quite some time. It took us literally years to get our special report on the family out, in large part because nobody has found the silver bullet answer to the demographic crisis. We spent years studying it and visiting foreign countries. In fact, Vlad was one of the people who helped us learn the lessons from Europe and what works and what doesn't work. We started out by focusing exclusively on the number of babies born. Right? That is the demographic cliff that we were facing. It's a matter of mathematics. If you don't have a above replacement birth rate, the population will disappear by default. The American experiment will be lost by default. And it's the greatest existential threat our society faces. However, we ran into a couple of issues. Nobody figured out a policy solution that substantially raised the birth rate back to the replacement level. And still, nobody has figured that out. And then we figured out, okay, what other issues can we address that can help with this problem? And in part, talking to Vlad and other folks, we came upon marriage as being this linchpin. And Lyman Stone mentioned it in his panel earlier, that marriage is actually one of the more effective ways of increasing the birth rate. And by the way, we're the Heritage Foundation. We're the conservative mothership, as we're sometimes called. And we are as pro-family as it gets. And family, we mean a mom, a dad, in a committed union with children, raising them that stability and in a committed relationship for life. Right? That's that vision that leads to the maximal human flourishing. And by the way, it leads to higher birth rates. And by the way, it leads to greater human happiness and lower depression rates. So it all kind of came together, which is why our policy solutions are key to marriage. That's what makes our policy solutions distinctive. They all have marriage at the core. Now we have three different policy experts here in their own various areas. I want to start by asking you all. I'll start with Rachel. How did we get to this point? And from your lens, you worked a lot on the welfare state. How do we get to the point where marriage was seen as not just optional, but in some cases a negative?
Thanks, Roger. So the U.S. government actively penalizes marriage, and it does this primarily through the welfare system. Now, we have had we can go back to the 1960s when welfare programs greatly expanded. So this has been going on for 60 years, but plus, because there were welfare programs even prior to that. So this has been going on for generations. And when we think about it, yes, as Roger said, marriage is that is where children are raised. Those who are married are far more likely to have children, and it's the best place for children to be raised. Children raised in married parent homes are far less likely to be poor, and beyond that, they're also much less likely to experience a multitude of risks that probably many of you are familiar with. This I hope that you've heard these statistics. Just lower risk of dropping out of school, greater educational attainment, better health, better physical, emotionally and physically. They're also a lot less likely to experience abuse, and yet our government penalizes marriage. And how does it do this? Well, if we look at our welfare system, which is a very large system that consists of a web of 90 plus programs or 90 and growing, and it's a $1.7 trillion welfare system. So this is not, this is not a small, isolated program. A few programs. It's very large, and it touches many people. So let's say, for example, let's look at a mother. She's a single mother. She has 2 young children. She's working, minimum wage-ish, and making about $20,000 a year. So she's going to be eligible and likely receiving a large package of welfare benefits, things like Medicaid, cash assistance from the Earned Income Tax Credit, possibly from the TANF. She'd be receiving food stamps. Her children would be receiving school meals, or if the child is in a child care program, the younger child, non-school age, she'd be receiving child care assistance, or and there's school meal program or meal programs for child care programs. What else am I missing? I feel like I'm missing something big, but potentially like housing assistance. So let's say then she is living with the father of those children, but they're not married, and he's earning about $30,000 a year. Now, if they remain unmarried and his income is off the books, she'll continue to receive those benefits. But the moment they decide to get married, and suddenly his income is now officially there, what happens? Well, their benefits are going to be substantially reduced. Basically we have this setup that is prohibiting or is inhibiting them from entering into marriage. Now, that it's if they're cohabitation and marriage are also not the same thing. A cohabiting couple is much less likely to stay together. If you look at the data, it's about 50% of couples who are cohabiting at the time of the child's birth. 50% of those couples will have broken up by the time that child reaches his 3rd birthday, compared to about, I want to say it's like 12 or 15% of married couples. So this is a huge difference. These are not comparable institutions. The other thing, too, is that our welfare system undermines work, and that undermines fatherhood, because it says, look, if you don't work, then because most programs do not have a work requirement, that's how it undermines work. And the father has traditionally been the breadwinner. Fathers continue to be either the primary breadwinner or a primary breadwinner. So by undermining work, we undermine fatherhood, we undermine marriage. So this is why, when we look in the United States, we look at marriage decline, and it's happening across the board, income, education level, but primarily where we have seen the greatest destruction is among lower income Americans. And just to note, too, that welfare marriage penalties, we're not just talking about, the lowest quintile, we're talking further up among lower middle income families as well. So this is one way that we have gotten ourselves into this mess of broken families.
So how many thousands of dollars potentially are we talking about if a person gets married who is receiving government assistance?
Yeah, and so that's going to vary depending on the income. But for the example that I gave, if you had that, $20,000, $20,000 from the mother, $30,000 from the father, they'd be getting, with their combined earnings and their welfare, they'd be getting around $80,000. But if they got married, then they would lose about $15,000 in benefits. So it's a lot of money that they're losing. Now it's going to vary. It's kind of it's a big. If you look at, anyway, I was at a working group. Eric Randolph and then Robert Rector here have done a lot of work on this. But they've got their heat maps of like where things are dropping off. But yes, we're talking significant amount of money. And also, it's about around 80%. Some of kind of those lower middle income couples are subject to some type of marriage penalty that varies in size.
I think if you're in a hole, and that's the marriage crisis, the first thing you stop digging. So stop penalizing marriage and people who actually try to get out of poverty by getting married. It's quite counterproductive. Delano, you've done a lot of study on the Black family and the breakdown there. Talk to us a bit about the cultural forces, broadly speaking, that have contributed to this breakdown in family and marriage.
Yeah, so what I like to say is that whenever we think about changes in family dynamics, family structure, family outcomes, I think of one of at least three fundamental elements. There's the institution of marriage, there's the role of men, there's the role of women. Particularly in the Black family, and I cover this in my book, and thank you for plugging that, Roger. The Vanishing Black Family, out June 16th. Available now for pre-order wherever books are sold. But I talk about how the institution of chattel slavery and the institution of marriage are fundamentally incompatible. Right? Marriage comes with a set of duties and obligations that husband and wife have to one another, and those duties cannot be completely fulfilled in an environment where a third party owns you and or your spouse. And then I go on to talk, and this picks up on what Rachel was saying, and both also Rachel and what Carrie was saying in the previous panel, which is in the 1960s, you had the rise of two cultural shocks that hit at almost the exact same time. The rapid expansion of the welfare state that displaced men from their traditional and rightful role as providers in their home, and sort of the advent of the second wave feminist movement, which I would argue deceive women into believing that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic in men but empowering in women, that marriage is oppressive, that the home is a prison, and that children are a burden. So when you do those two, when those two things happen, that creates a disruption within the home, and then you see those things sort of perpetuating themselves down through the generations. So, for instance, in 1965, about a quarter of Black children were born to unmarried parents. That was considered a national emergency. So if anyone's heard of the Moynihan Report, which came out in 1965, officially titled The Negro Family, A Case for National Action, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Assistant Labor Secretary, was saying, look, this family breakdown is a real issue. That was 25% non-marital birth rate. By the 1970s, it crossed 50%. By the 1980s, it hit 60%. Late 90s, it peaked at 70% and has been at or around 70% since then. And in Washington, D.C., this city where we sit right now, the non-marital birth rate among Black families is 77%. So close to 80% of Black children in this city are born to unmarried parents, compared to 93% of white children who are born to married parents. So that is a 70 percentage point gap. Several things are going on there, and I'll sort of end this part of my comments quickly, hopefully. Several things are going on there. One, again, you see the interaction of policy and culture. So let me put some meat on the bones for you. The Washington Post did a story 2 years ago on a program, a DC program, and I worked, for those who don't know, before coming to Heritage, I worked 15 years in local government in Washington, D.C. So I know D.C. government quite well. The program is called Strong Families, Strong Futures. Basically a UBI program. The pilot program part of it gave $10,800 to new and expecting moms. When the Washington Post wrote it up, the first woman that they profiled, they described as a stay-at-home mother of three. And I said, okay, this is a good start. No, my wife's a stay-at-home mom, a homeschooler. I'm looking forward to hear what this woman's husband does. They said she was living in a subsidized two-bedroom apartment, was on WIC, SNAP, TANF, so sort of the basic welfare programs, cash transfer programs. And then she participated in this program. And her situation was one of 2 times that they mentioned the word father, only because it said that the father of her 3 children went along because she used $6,000 of her $10,800 for a luxury trip to Florida, basically to give her kids, more exposure. I just came back from Disney. That's probably about right in terms of how much, it'll cost to, take a family. We're a family of 6. I think they're a family of 5. But it was clear to me that the father in this instance was the government, right? That was who was the head of her household. And it's clear to me that if you don't address these family dynamics, the breakdown of the family actually becomes woven into both policy and programs, to the extent where dads are not even mentioned. And this particular program does not deal with the relationship between men, between the mothers and the father or fathers of their children. The program District Dads, also administered by the same entity, does deal with the relationship between dads and moms, because the administrators understand that if dad has a bad relationship with mom, he is probably not likely to see and have a good relationship with his children. So there are a lot of dynamics. Again, it's an interplay of both family and culture. But I do think that there is more that the government, both federal and especially local, can do to begin to create a culture that revives marriage and makes it clear that, family structure is important.
So the U.S. is unique in that we're not the worst in terms of overall marriage rates in the world, but we are in terms of out-of-wedlock births. We lead the world in a number of out-of-wedlock births. Why is the U.S. distinctive in this particular regard, you think?
I think it's a mix of several things, and all of them we've talked about, right? I think the declining importance of religion, other cultural factors that help keep a particular life script in place. So in 1965, again, I'll go back to 65 because that's when a lot of things started to change. The national non-marital birth rate was about 8%. So 8% of all American children were born out of wedlock. Today it's 40%. So again, part of it, a decline in religion. Part of it, if a man got a woman pregnant in 1965 and marriage was not on the table, her father, along with his Remington, would make sure that marriage was put on the table. Right? So you had the reality of shotgun marriages completely disappeared today. You also have, again, 6 decades of cultural programming that says that marriage is not valuable, desirable, accessible, or indispensable for the purpose of forming a family. So a lot of it is, again, it's policy, it's welfare policy, which provides incentives to have children out of wedlock. Part of it is culture, and part of it, honestly, is a failure for parents, even ones who are concerned about family formation out there, to hold the little bit of territory that they have in here, which is forming their own children. So sometimes what you'll see is kids who come from, married background, two-parent home, begin to adopt sort of the family formation patterns of the broader culture. And I've seen this, particularly when it comes to cohabitation, which used to, as the old folks that I grew up with, they call it shacking up. And typically a man and woman would shack up if they were headed towards marriage. Now cohabitation happens a lot earlier in the relationship life cycle, not after 5 years of dating and 2 years of engagement. It's after a few months of dating, particularly if you live in a large city where the cost of living is high. So when you do that, you set in place patterns of behavior where oftentimes it's a yes to the baby, where baby is yes, but marriage is maybe.
So Emma, you bring your children to work. You brought your baby to work today. Thank you. And you're in the Tech Policy Center, Tech and Human Flourishing. What is the role of technology in this entire question of marriage and family? And there are many aspects to it. I mentioned with Senator Banks, there's ideas of technological solutions to the fertility crisis. There is the rise of online dating replacing the old-fashioned way of actually meeting people face-to-face. There is pornography ubiquity, addiction to screens. Like, how do all these things play a role in the crisis we have in marriage and family?
So in DC, if you've been here for more than 5 minutes, you've probably heard someone make a case that religion is downstream from policy or policy is downstream from culture. And then everyone gets really upset trying to decide what the linchpin is that everything else follows from. And perhaps because I'm in the Tech Policy Center, I genuinely tend to think that when it comes to these conversations of marriage and family and even dating in the United States, it often comes down to the question of technology and how technology is unknowingly shaping the way that we see the world, our relationships, and even our children. So in the 19th century, there was a philosopher, his name was Marshall McLuhan. He's famous for the phrase, the medium is the message, which is very crucial for a lot of the people thinking about the philosophy of technology. But he has this example where he says that when a new technology comes on the scene, we cannot judge the technology simply by what it technically does, but by the social and psychic consequences it bears upon society. So he uses the example of the railroad and the railway in the United States. And so you can define what a train literally is. But he says that actually misses the point, because what happened when we actually had the railway system established across the United States was that it changed the means of communication and of travel. It changed the way we thought about cities and visiting our family and friends in a way that radically reshaped the United States, and in this sense, probably for good. And so I think about all of these questions of marriage, children, dating through that lens of how are the technologies that we have tacitly or even unknowingly embraced really reshaped the way that we think about these questions. And so I go back to, as Delano said, really the 1960s, where you see the birth rate peak in the 1950s and 60s at like 3.7 births or 3.6 births per family on average. And then starting in 1972 and 1973, you see a massive drop-off in the number of births. Now, what happens in 1972 and 1973? Well, you have abortion erroneously decided as part of the Constitution through Roe v. Wade. But 1973 is also the year that hormonal birth control became a widespread used drug. And so 10 million women in 1973 were using the birth control pill. By 1978 and 1979, in vitro fertilization was created and began rapidly increasing in use ever since then. And then you have every technological development from the iPhone and dating apps online since the 2000s onward. And so while there's, of course, I think very different moral categories to think through each of those technologies, what we cannot deny is that as each of these reproductive technologies and social technologies has been introduced into our common life, often introduced long before we really have the moral language to think through how these technologies are actually impacting us and our relationships, not simply what the technologies are doing or what they're promising to do. You've seen a marked decline in the number of children that are being born. The United States has never gone above the replacement rate since 1973. And as all of our panelists have discussed, marriage rates have continued to decline. And sort of the joke now is like, we keep talking about how young people need to get married, but it turns out young people don't even know how to date. And so we have a massive problem, because now it's like, well, how do we get young people together in the first place in a healthy relationship or a healthy social setting where they can actually learn how to interact with one another and even consider a serious relationship, much less marriage, much less children. And so I think, yeah, those are some of the ways that I think technology has just been devastating for our understanding of the human person. But technology is not all bad. And in fact, technology can also be this incredible blessing. So at the same time, I think we need to be very critical in our assessment of the technologies we've embraced as a society and the impact it's had. And at the same time, be incredibly optimistic about technologies that are truly innovative, restorative, and life-affirming that can actually better help us reveal and understand and delight in who the human person is. So whether that's things like somatic gene editing, literally healing a young boy from deafness, a genetic condition of deafness, and now he can hear because of this gene editing technology that was introduced, or the ways that we're are able to address and treat and actually restore natural fertility in men and women who want to have children because of these advancements in reproductive medicine in the proper, true sense. I think there's a lot to consider there because that actually helps us better experience the natural relationships that bring such delight to life rather than distracting us away from it in one form or another.
Well, building on that, you mentioned the potential good gene editing. What are the sort of darker versions of gene editing and control over our progeny?
Yes. Okay, so when you hear gene editing, you're probably thinking, Emma, isn't gene editing all about designer babies and engineered children and horrible things? And yes, sometimes it is. So the two different kinds that are worth keeping in mind here, there's somatic gene editing, which deals with the genetic editing of cells or genes within a human person. So if a child is born deaf due to a genetic malfunction in their DNA or elsewhere, depending on the condition, you're able to go into the body and actually restore or replace or fix that issue. That is not something that changes their progeny or the children that they'll have. It's done on a child who is born. And so you're not actually editing a human embryo, for example. The other kind of gene editing is germline gene editing. And this is where you get the designer babies concern, because germline gene editing is exclusively done on human embryos and then gametes and, well, eggs, so eggs and sperm. And so it inherently deals with the reproductive capabilities. So any change done through germline gene editing not only affects that human embryo, sperm, or egg, but every single child that person could then go to have. And it's where you tend to see these sorts of attempts at gene editing that aren't actually focused on therapeutic attempts to heal the human person, but can oftentimes very quickly move into these attempts to improve or optimize or select certain kinds of people. And so if you think about this in the case of polygenic genetic screening of human embryos, for example, you have companies in Silicon Valley that are promising to screen your human embryos and give you an active score or an accurate score, so they claim, about up to 2,000 conditions that your child may or may not develop, because we're talking about human embryos. It's not a diagnosis, it's just a screening test. But instead of healing something like deafness, it doesn't heal anything. It just says, well, your human embryo has the chance of developing male pattern baldness. Imagine if your parents didn't select you because you were going to go bald one day. Kind of harsh for some people, I think. Or it has to do with things like height or IQ or Alzheimer's or cystic fibrosis, conditions that may or may not be life-threatening, oftentimes deal with really deal with cosmetic preferences. But in either case, the technology isn't actually healing the human, it's just screening and selecting. And that's where it goes to a very dark place of consumer eugenics very, very quickly.
Yeah, and you combine this consumerist model where not only is it destructive often of the human embryo, but then they will outsource the actual caring of the child with a surrogate. Right? So it's this new way of thinking that there's going to be a technical solution for everything. Okay, so let's shift now to the policy solutions that we have been working on at Heritage for quite some time. I had focused a lot on what we could do at the federal level, but that's not the exclusive zone. Our three marquee legislative ideas are, again, focused on marriage. One is nest accounts, which are taking the idea of the Trump accounts and making it apply to marriage. So the nest accounts and the Trump accounts are simple. When a child is born, the government deposits money into an account that grows over time, similar to a 401k, and it's available to them upon adulthood for certain reasons. Under the Trump accounts, which were passed in a one big beautiful bill, it's for buying a house, going to college, or starting a business. So it's based on particular events that, activities that you do, I should say. And that's kind of a way of boosting your entrance into adulthood and making your adult life easier. Conspicuously absent was marriage. Okay. Marriage was historically seen as the entrance into adulthood, historically in America. So our idea is to take the Trump version and make it Trump 2.0. We call it the nest account, a nest egg, We have a separate account just for marriage, about $2,500, and available and redeemable at the event of marriage. And you can use money for whatever you want. Okay. And if you have two young people, say they're around 28, by the time you've compounded that interest, you're talking like $35,000 plus between the two of you. We believe that would be quite the incentive that is very cheap on the front end. Right? $2,500 in the beginning, and you get $35,000 to $38,000 at the back end. And we have it such that it's a window between 18 and 30. 30 is the median age of marriage almost. And if you don't hit that window, then it's there for you as a retirement account. It's there going to be waiting for you. Second idea we have, building on a child tax credit, which Heritage was one of the pioneers of. If you are married, working, and have a child, you get a bonus. Similar to the adoption tax credit we have now, it's about $17,000. We spread it out over 3 years, and you get a 25% bonus for the third child and up. So again, taking tried and true ideals, but keying it to marriage. And one of the benefits of this particular proposal is that it's structured to specifically offset the marriage penalties in the EITC, right? So as the EITC phases out, this one phases in to try to address the marriage penalty problem itself. Again, keyed to marriage. And the third one is similar to Senator Banks' idea that he's proposed on Capitol Hill. It's to equalize the subsidies we give to out-of-house commercial childcare with in-home childcare provisions. A common complaint people have is it's hard to raise a child today, it's very expensive. Let's make it easier. Great. But we make it easier only in one way. If you send your child to daycare in a commercial setting, then you're going to get all sorts of credits. Well, that's in a way saying if you provide it yourself as a mom or dad at home, you're going to get no credit whatsoever. So it's shifting people into one mode of life and one structure when a lot of people want to be able to raise their kids at home. And in fact, they lead to better outcomes for the kids when you have the parents there providing that time directly to their child. So our third proposal, again, also tied to marriage. You have an equalization between child care credits outside of the home for inside of the home for married families. That's the core proposals that we want to see action on Capitol Hill. We also recommend significant action with the administration, a whole of government approach. The left has done this on things like gender ideology, on ESG. They take every lever of government and they find a way to direct it to their policy goals. Let's do that for family. There's no bigger, more important issue. And we saw Secretary Duffy of the Department of Transportation is one of the first to implement this sort of approach when they have grant proposals, say for putting an off-ramp on a federally funded highway. They are specifically taking into account marriage rates and families. So if there's one town that has higher marriage and family formation and another town 2 miles away that has lower, the town that has better family prospects gets a preference for that highway fund spending. So the off-ramp will go there versus there. That creates enough of a core critical mass of married families, and that starts creating a culture around marriage and family support. And if we do this, and I've used the analogy of something like the Manhattan Project, to get government to take this crisis seriously enough and find every tool and every measure, at the federal level with congressional legislation, at the administrative level with regulations and deregulation and pro-family regulation, that's what it's going to take. Will it be enough? No. Government by itself will not be enough. We have to be quite realistic about it. Can we do it without government? My answer is yes. I'm sorry, my answer is no, we cannot do it without government. Excuse me. The answer is no, we cannot do it without government. Government helped get us into this mess. Government is going to be instrumental in getting us out of it, but it will not be enough by itself. Let's talk through the other policy solutions we're thinking of. Let's go with the tech side of things. What are some of the tech ideas in our paper that we've brought forth?
Yes, and this is what I love about the Heritage Family Policy paper, which, by the way, sits at a very accessible and readable 58,000 words, which is longer than Delano's book that's coming out and my book that just came out, but it's highly accessible, and it's because there isn't a single solution to declining birth rates. And so, as Roger said, it needs to be an all-hands-on-deck question of how do we actually address every aspect of society well. And so no single solution on its own will be sufficient, and yet taken together, we might actually get somewhere. And this is, as an aside, what I've always loved about Heritage is that we've never had a single department that was the family policy department or a single scholar that was the family policy scholar, but instead, many years ago, from the very top all the way down, there was a concerted effort to say, for every single issue we work on, domestic or international, the fundamental question is, how does this policy area impact the American family? And is it going to support the American family, or is it going to hinder the American family? And that is the basis by which we make decisions as to what sorts of policies we want to support or not. So within the Tech Policy Center, the way that that's looked is it's taken on a few different forms. Within my particular area, I work a lot on women's health, infertility, and reproductive medicine. And so we have pioneered restorative reproductive medicine, which is a root cause approach to treating infertility. And so that has really taken the incredible advancements that we've seen in science, medicine, and technology to actually understand what infertility is, how it's, what its causes are within the man and woman's body, and then create personalized treatments to actually restore and optimize their natural fertility. Because a huge part of the discussion today that we haven't really even gotten into is that for many Americans, and in fact, a growing number of Americans, it's not that they don't want children, it's that they are physically struggling to have those children. And that is undoubtedly a part of this declining birth rate discussion, with cases of infertility rising over the last 2 decades alone. And so how do we actually meet those parents where they are and give them the tools they need to address their infertility and have the children they desire? Elsewhere, we are doing things on kids' online safety and really prioritizing the health and innocence of children online. And so it's everything from addressing pornography to predatory practices on social media platforms, to ensuring that data security is a top priority so that cases of child sexual exploitation online, the depression and anxiety that comes from an overuse or exposure to social media isn't then having downstream effects in the relationships that people build or fail to build, the marriages and children they're having. Because the reality is that the greater increase we've seen in social media use has also correlated with a decline in people forming meaningful relationships and getting married and having kids. And again, that's just one piece of it, but is a very important piece of the puzzle at the same time. Yeah, and so those are some of, I think, the most important tech areas that we're really prioritizing to support the family at all levels.
Rachel, on the welfare front, what are our leading welfare reform ideas?
Sure. So, well, these come in a couple different forms. So, as I mentioned, work and how our welfare system undermines work and how that undermines fatherhood. Then, work requirements. That's something that we have, talked about for years, and we have implemented with welfare reform in 1996. But unfortunately, there's that was one program that was very successful. However, as I mentioned, it's a very large welfare system, and also those reforms from 96 need to be strengthened. So work requirements, particularly in SNAP, the food stamps program, as it's more generally known, which is one of the largest programs. We've talked about reforming that and work requirements there. But another thing, and that with the welfare reform in 1996, yes, work was a big piece of that. But however, it was also marriage, and strengthening marriage was the other part. And so all states receive money that they can use for strengthening marriage, and that they are supposed to be using for doing that. And there's very little, though, that states are doing. There are some good examples. Oklahoma has done good work on this, and Utah, and they use that money. They use some of that money or their own state dollars to do healthy marriage education. Now, because as I mentioned, we have generations of marital breakdown, particularly in lower income communities. And so people have, like, the infrastructures, the script of how we do marriage has dwindled there. And even just getting the message out that marriage matters, using public messaging campaigns to let people know, hey, if children born within marriage are 5 times less likely to be poor. And using resources as well for things like healthy marriage education to give people the skills and the knowledge, and so that they have the confidence to be able to move forward into marriage. So those are a couple of the things on the welfare front that I think that are critical and that we've talked about for a long time.
Healthy marriage education. So Delano, the media really loved the idea that you put in the paper of marriage boot camps. What did you mean by that?
I thought it was a good idea. I didn't think they would pick up on it that way. So when I talked about marriage boot camps, when I wrote it in the paper, I was thinking, imagine a program that starts with cohabiting couples who share at least one biological child. So they live together, they have a child together, right? Likely finances are tied up together in some way, shape, or form. And the idea of the boot camp was to take them through, a marriage and relationship education course. Could be 6 months, could be a year, could be administered by a local church or a local nonprofit, using existing federal funds, because the federal government, when I checked last year, had about $100 million earmarked for marriage and relationship education, fatherhood programs, family strengthening programs. So you would take that couple through this boot camp. You'd cover communication. You would cover conflict resolution, intimacy, all the finances, all the major issues that couples will run into at some point. And successful completion of the program means that whenever this program is done, right, this man and woman are ready to walk down the aisle. So success is not, you take a survey prior, a survey prior to the program beginning, and you say, I don't really feel, I rate my relationship a 4 out of 10. And then you take it afterwards, and then, now I rate it a 6 out of 10. No, success is on date certain. You are walking down the aisle. We can have, the wedding and reception at a large public venue. It could be a local sports arena. It could be at a university. It could be at a conservative think tank, depending on where you are. You would pair that couple with marriage mentors, particularly couples who have gone through similar issues. And then one of the other ideas that we talked about in the paper is providing a financial incentive, because again, this would likely be low-income, working-class couples. So that financial incentive, we said $5,000 in the paper. In my book, I said 10 because I was feeling a little bit more generous. But this would be money provided by a private foundation, a third-party foundation. So this would not be government funds. Could structure it as a loan or structure it in some other way to disincentivize people to just take advantage of the money and then quickly divorce. And then you would measure outcomes at 5, 10, 15 years to see whether those couples stay together. It blends sort of the innovation in terms of the relationship education, the relationship education component, plus the monetary incentives that conservatives, I think, are more open to. And in theory, you could get some people on the center-left to be open to it because they love spending money. They just don't like the idea of requiring marriage in order to do it. So that's what that idea was about. But people took it, the media, progressive media took it and said they just want to trap women in marriages and so on and so forth. So but my thinking there, and this came up on the first panel, is that marriage has really cratered among low income and the working class. So if we want to see movement, we have to begin tailoring policy solutions to those particular constituencies and demographics. And right now, much of the marriage and family discourse is focused on white-collar professionals. Some of it very good discourse, and some of it I participated in and my colleagues. But if you go to a working-class community, whether in West Baltimore, Southeast DC, or North Philadelphia, and you start talking about, trad wives and girl bosses, that's not something that those individuals are encountering. I think we have a problem in the white collar space because the messaging is very much anti-family. Sheryl Sandberg of Lean In fame has said that she wants to push back on the trad wife movement, but in these working class communities, you're talking about young people who have no reason to believe that marriage should come before baby carriage because they haven't seen it in their own home, not the homes of their friends. Their elected officials don't talk about it. The church doesn't talk about it. So part of it is thinking about marriage culture in the same way we think about agriculture, which is to say we have to plant, water, and give life to things that we want to grow, and we have to weed and prune things that threaten a bountiful harvest.
So you mentioned that some family policies could get support from the left, or center left at least. And there's actually a big debate on the right as to what is the proper role of government on these questions. And we admit that, yes, government cannot by itself be the solution, but we can't have a solution without it. And that's a point of contention with a lot of folks. And the proposals that Heritage supports in terms of the tax credits, et cetera, for marriage and family and childcare, that's less than 1% of what we spend on entitlements. Okay? That's Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. We think that that's an investment that will pay off tremendous dividends, right? Even if we just get a 10, 20% boost in the marriage rate, and that will have dramatic effects downstream. And we're talking about generations. And the analogy I want to think about is it's almost as if we're on the Titanic, and there's the iceberg, and we know that the current track we're on is going towards that iceberg. And there are so many things that need to come into play right now, and everybody needs to play a role to steer that ship. And by the way, when you steer that ship, people will be healthier, people will be happier, people will have higher incomes when it's all keyed to marriage, and we all need to play our role. We have time for questions. Now, please raise your hand, wait for a microphone to come to you, say your name and who you're from, and please keep your question in the form of a question. In the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Sven Larsson. I'm an economics writer for the European Conservative. I've been very much enjoying this event. One of the things I write about is the Hungarian experiment with reshaping the welfare state. There was a debate in Europe when Fidesz started where they were heavily criticized for going away from the redistributive welfare state, the one that we built. Delano, you mentioned 1965, the war on poverty started. Now, when I read your report, which I think was fascinating, very, very good, and really encouraging, I saw one step, and here's my question. Do you think this is a good time to take the next step and contrast the economic redistribution philosophy behind the war on poverty against, let me take Hungary as the contrast, a conservative welfare state that does not redistribute based on income, but has a set of benefits that encourage the formation, the growth, and the sustainability of families. Is that I don't see that philosophical discussion in your report, but I see it as the logical next step. Do you agree with that?
Could you repeat that last part? What philosophical position?
On the one hand, you have, let me frame it a little bit
briefly,
pointedly. The socialist idea of economic redistribution, reduce economic differences. Our welfare state is built to give benefits to lower income people so that their income is increased relative to those who make more. They're taxed with progressive taxes to finance those benefits.
So
the contrast
I think I got your point.
Okay.
So the socialist contrast of Europe versus America and that impact of family formation.
Well, okay. So I guess I would start to say, yeah, I mean, the way that our welfare system is set up and most welfare, right, it's to give, money to those who are low income. Now, I think really, the most practical way that we need to do that is just, I don't think that you're going to be able to just kind of completely alter the way that that's done. But I think the way that you make that, so that we're actually addressing, what we want to do is address the causes of poverty, not just the consequences, which is what Lyndon B. Johnson said in his famous War on Poverty speech. But so that we are, that it's tied to work, so that we say, okay, yes, here's benefit, but you need to be working, looking for work, preparing for work, so that we are moving people, not just, we're not just giving them money, but they are moving forward. It's actually about social mobility. And then, yes, certainly not harming marriage, and then also, trying to, because we have this huge mess of marital breakdown, we need to strengthen marriage so that, work and marriage are the greatest protectors against poverty, and they promote social mobility. So I think those are the types of policies we need.
Jay, you get privileged.
So feel free to ask the other folks from the previous panel as well. And so on this one, I think we maybe didn't say it enough, but in the paper we do make a key distinction, because you're exactly right. We're not proposing wealth redistribution, which is essentially, okay, these people have too much stuff, these people don't have enough, let's take some of their stuff and move it over here. Government policy and tax policy is always about things that are public goods, and those might affect different people differently. The burden of our report, philosophically, is that family formation is a public good. It is long-term beneficial to everyone, including people that never marry. And so that's why the state has an interest in it, because you're not going to have a culture or a country if you destroy this fundamental cell of civilization, namely the family. That's the key thing, and that's what justifies the state in having an interest in it.
Wonderful. Over there, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, I came from Hungary, and I am a social policy expert with my colleague. So if I can tell you something briefly from home, I will read a little bit because my English is not as good as yours. But what is fundamental, that the family is strengthening is not just a social issue. It is more like that. Especially the early childhood development, because these early 3 years is a kind of crisis. It means that if in this point the children and the whole family can get any support, the divorces and the marriage became weaker, and then the divorces number were increasingly high. Plus, if this early childhood level, the children can get the best service, their mental condition won't be healthy, which cause an unhealthy society. Second, if we would like to straighten the whole society, included the underclass social level, we have to straighten the whole family, and it will help for the ones who are not in this level. So that's why Hungary's government decided not only support the underclass social level people, but the whole family at itself. So we hope, because now we have a strange situation and a new step, we are not effectively happy everybody, but we hope the best line will stay, because as you say, without family and without working together, civil organizations like yours and like ours, Parents House Foundation, won't be any developing. So if you have any question about Hungary, I'm here to answer later.
And your name, ma'am?
Thank you.
Your name?
Yeah, my name is Judith Regős, the president of the Parents House Foundation, and I was a strategic partner of the Hungarian government in the field of family support.
Wonderful. So Hungary has put 6% of their GDP towards family policies, and we had met with Hungarian officials in development of our report. We have a whole section on Hungary, and you're right, it's not just about addressing poverty. The proposals we have address marriage, and they're tied to work. So work, family, and children all hang together right there.
Thanks. My name is Daniel Hess. I write under the handle More Births on X. Some of you may follow me. But one thing I really want to talk about is the question of whether it's possible to challenge sort of the senior spending, because there's really a pull between spending on seniors and spending on young people. There was a recent thing that passed where taxes were eliminated on Social Security. There's a movement across the country to completely eliminate property taxes. Now, these are almost the only taxes that seniors pay, and the financial picture of seniors in this country is much stronger than the financial position of young people, and almost all spending is on seniors, so it kind of squeezes out family spending. And we don't want to talk about one at the expense of the other, but it's certainly the case that taxes must be paid, and the more things are emphasized towards seniors, the heavier the burden is on young people, and the harder it is for young people to form families.
So with Social Security, when it was first devised, it was something like 27 to 22 workers per retiree. Now it's closer to 4 workers per retiree. It's going to go down to 2, and that's going to create social tension. And we do not want to see a shrinking pie and people fighting each other based on age distinctions over that pie. And what we've had a breakdown in the notion of grandparents and families being taken care of in the same household. Delano, you want to talk about the role of grandparents in multi-generational households?
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes there's a focus on the nuclear family unit, and obviously that's a good thing, but multi-generational sort of family policy to me is the best way to approach this, because the children learn and benefit from the age and wisdom of their grandparents, and the grandparents benefit from the youth and vigor of the grandchildren. So it's one of the things that often gets lost. Here's one of the challenges, and this is a challenge particularly, again, with respect to the more white-collar professions. The challenge is that college is typically the first life event that displaces a child from their family and the neighborhood that they grew up in. And many kids never come back. I grew up in New York. My wife is from Houston. We settled in D.C. Not having family around certainly impacted what we thought about in terms of creating a family together. I contrast that with my best friend who still lives in Brooklyn. He actually purchased a home next door to his parents. So when the police officer and his wife, who retired, moved down to Florida, and their 3 Rottweilers, he purchased that home. Him and his wife moved into that home when they got married. His sister, brother-in-law, and their 2 kids live maybe 3 minutes away driving. So it's just a very different family dynamic. And I'm not sure that we're willing, again, particularly in the white-collar professions and policymakers, to challenge the college or bust mindset that many of us grow up with. So I think part of it, again, is the life script that we give to young people. And the other part of it, Roger, and this goes to one of the most important things that doesn't get discussed enough about our family report, which is not just the idea of tying these benefits to marriage, but it's the timing of marriage. A lot of people talk about the success sequence. Get married, finish high school, get a job, get married, then have children. Your chances of being in poverty is in the single digits. We don't talk about the success timing, which is to say, if you just follow the sequence, you can end up just delaying marriage, and we may end up on Spain's trajectory, where the average age of first marriage for a man is 36 and is 34 for a woman. Consider this, and I'll stop here. If I'm a man, I get married at 36, I have my first child at 40. I have a son. He follows in my footsteps. Married at 36, first child at 40. I become a first-time grandfather at 80 years old, which is a couple years past the average life expectancy for a man. I've in effect cut out an entire generation of my family. So it's harder for me to pass on those things, this is where the question started, to my grandchildren, because by the time he's ready for coach pitch baseball, they may have to wheel me into the game. So part of it is again, the foundation of marriage, the sequence, marriage before baby carriage, but also the timing. And the timing, I think, is the hardest thing to affect with public policy.
Let's get somebody with a question for Emma, please. In the back.
Thanks. I'm Rachel Wagley. I'm Chief of Staff for Congressman Blake Moore of Utah. We did CDC and Trump accounts and other things. With Emma, it sounds like a lot of what you all have said and what Lyman's recent Substacks have said is that this has a lot to do with casual interactions declining. People aren't meeting each other. They aren't out and about. They're not dating. And that's where that decline from 2010 started. Maybe we can't fix the 1970s decline, but can we fix the 2010 decline? Where do policymakers come in?
Yes, this is a really good question. So are you focusing mostly on the dating and marriage piece of it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this is a great question. I think when it comes to this topic on federal policy, much of my thought around this comes down to different cultural and messaging conversations that we are and are not having. How are we talking about marriage? How are we talking about the importance and beauty and delight of this great adventure of marriage and having children? Are we actually diving into healthy dating practices and creating environments that are phone-free or phone-reduced, where people can actually look each other in the eye and get to know one another? But when it comes to federal policy, I do think that there are things that we can and should consider along these lines, whether that is thinking about new pathways such as like apprenticeship options for entering adulthood and finding sustainable employment that doesn't necessarily require a college degree as the entry point. So that's a huge way that you actually set people up for success, both in their jobs and in their careers, but also in their relationships, right? Because marriageable men is a huge part of the discussion, which means we need to open more pathways to support and encourage that. I also think that there's the aspect beyond the marriageable men side of things. There's also the question of how are we thinking through remote and contract work in particular. So something that we talk about in the family policy paper is reducing unnecessary red tape around contract work and flexible work in the United States, which is in many cases actually increasingly something that men are taking advantage of, but also historically something that moms have taken a lot of advantage of when it comes to structuring work in a way that actually supports their long-term career interests, but also their immediate interest of wanting to be present and flexible with their children. And then certainly rethinking access and affordability of single-family homes. And that's something that I see a lot of congressmen talking about and working on that I'm really, really excited about. And in fact, Emma Waters at the Bipartisan Policy Institute, not the same one, but I get all of her Google updates, has done a lot on rethinking the way that we're approaching housing policy to really set up those young families for success on the front end, so that home ownership, which is a big piece of feeling like you're an adult and feeling like you're ready to have children, isn't an unnecessary barrier. And I think we've all seen the studies of like in what was it, like 1970s, 1960s, the majority of men and women were married, had a kid, and had a house by age 30. And today that's like 12% of 30-year-olds are married, have a kid, and own a house. And my husband and I are married and have children, and we're not quite 30, but we're gonna have to work really hard to actually buy a house by the time we turn 30. And part of it's just that the affordability question of what is a good investment and what's actually available to us is really, really difficult to navigate. And we are certainly far from the only people who were in that particular situation.
Question for you, Emma. If there were nest accounts waiting for you and had, say, $35,000 for you, would that help you buy a home?
That'd go a very long way in getting us a great home, yes.
Final question. Over that way.
Could we set a policy for the federal government and the state government only hire employees with a child? And also for the universities, they only admit the PhD and master's degree student with a child. Could we do that?
Well, that would defy the success sequence, right? So the success sequence begins with graduating high school, getting a job, and then getting married and having kids. But I do think there's probably a lot of fun conversations to have about how do we create environments, whether it's in higher education or in the work environment, that actually support people having babies. And like, I'm pregnant with my third daughter, and I've been at Heritage for 4 years, and I can say without a doubt, Heritage has created an environment that makes having children one of the greatest and easiest decisions for my husband and I to make, because we never have to ask, is my job or is my education at odds with my desire to have a family? But that, oh, I'm going to tell my vice president that I'm having a baby and he's going to be so excited for me. And they're going to find ways to support and encourage that and make it possible financially and work-wise to do that. And so I think really the question here is, how do we structure our business and our education around the goodness of the family and supporting that in all of the big and small ways that really count?
That's a wonderful way to end. So thank our panelists, Delano, Rachel, Emma. We are approaching the end. You guys can step off. We are approaching the end of our programming. And before we dismiss you to lunch, I'm going to bring up Carrie Lancaster, Senior Associate of Outreach, to talk about the Family First Initiative. Carrie.
Thank you, Roger, and hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Lancaster, and I'm on the outreach team here at the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to just give you a quick update on a new effort we're launching today called the Family First Initiative. Some of you might be familiar with the Parental Rights Initiative, which we launched about a year ago. The Family First Initiative builds on that foundation and is an expansion of our work to address the full range of issues impacting families today, whether it be in education, health, culture, or the economy. Our goal is to ensure that families have the resources and support necessary to protect their fundamental rights and truly flourish. This initiative is also an opportunity for partnership, so we'd love to elevate and help amplify the work that you and your wonderful organizations are doing. So if you're interested in learning more or interested in collaborating with us on this opportunity, please come talk to me after this or grab one of the palm cards that we have out on the registration desks. There's QR codes to our website and our newsletter that we're launching. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the summit.
Let's eat. That closes the event. Thank you all for coming. It's been fantastic.